Hi, folks. You're listening to a free version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. Special note for you this week. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but earlier in the week, in response to my criticism of Republicans and alt-right supporters of Roy Moore, Mike Cernovich, the guy who brought you Pizzagate, the guy who tweeted out all sorts of horrible things about women, who wrote a book on how to pick up women, literally a professional predator of women, dug into my tweets, found one from 2009 where I used some pretty racy satire to express my outrage at how people at that time were trying to rehabilitate Roman Polanski's image, to bring him back, I guess, to get maybe an Academy Award. I tweeted out a tweet that was pretty racy, but I still stand behind it. I was criticizing those who would defend a child predator. The alt-right has been using that tweet in an attempt to get me fired from MSNBC. They have written letters claiming that I am a pro-child rape host of this program, Ring of Fire Radio, in an attempt to alienate advertisers. You can help us push back on this. You're listening to the free podcast of Ring of Fire Radio by going to rofpodcast.com and signing up for our full show. You can help keep this show alive. I don't know what's going to happen, frankly, with MSNBC. I don't know what's going to be happening with our advertisers. We've heard from some, others we haven't heard anything from. We just don't know what's going to happen. But if you want to push back on this alt-right guy who was frankly retweeted by Seb Gorka, former Trump advisor, and Donald Trump Jr. himself, in an attempt, like I say, to get me fired and to make it impossible for this show to continue, head over to rofpodcast.com, become a member of this podcast, and basically tell Mike Cernovich that you just aren't going to let them win. Thanks very much, and I really do appreciate your support. Welcome to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Today on Ring of Fire, economist Stephanie Kelton will be here to discuss what's in Trump's tax reform plan and why it's been kept so secret. Former editor for Time magazine, Charles Alexander, will be here to tell us why he warned us not to let the Koch brothers buy that magazine and how it might impact the content of it going forward. Heather Digby Parton from Salon will be here to run down the most important news stories from the past week. And Ryan Singal from Contextly will be here to talk about the assault on net neutrality and what happens if the internet lands in the hands of big corporations. Don't forget, you can go to rofpodcast.com and sign up for the free 1-hour version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. And if you want the full show, commercial-free, become a member. That's the best way to support this program. That's rofpodcast.com. Here to help me run down some of the biggest headlines of the week, Heather Parton from Salon, or as you may know her from her blog, Hullabaloo Digby. So, Heather, another incredibly just bizarre week in the era of the Trump administration. But let's start with an issue that probably would be almost identical if we had a President Rubio or President Bush or President Republican of any other name than Donald Trump, and that is the tax bill that is winding its way through the Senate and may be en route to being signed by Donald Trump by the end of this year. I know you wrote a piece in Salon about it this week. Give me your take from a political perspective on this. And like I should also mention, later in the program, we're going to be talking to Stephanie Kelton about a lot of the more policy-oriented details of this. This is, just broadly speaking, massive tax cuts for the rich on the back of, broadly speaking, lower-income people and students and people who have health care. I mean, this is pretty naked.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is it's not just naked. The complete abdication of their alleged commitment to, fiscal responsibility and, deficit reduction and everything that they've been running on for years. The tax and spend liberals, are taxing you and they're spending all your money. We're going into debt. I mean, this has been their mantra for decades, and they're not even trying in this bill. Now, that is one thing I would say is slightly different, I think, about this than what we might expect if we had a president like Rubio or perhaps, Jeb Bush or somebody like that. Not that they wouldn't want to pass all these tax cuts, but I just have a feeling that they would be demanding that the Congress, try and make the numbers add up in some way, that they would create some sort of illusion, like the Bush tax cuts. Those were also big giveaways to the rich, but they, in the past, have always worked hard at trying to ensure that it looked as though the average American was going to benefit, and that even though, yes, it's trickle-down economics, but look, everybody's going to get a little piece of this, and it's good for everybody, it's your money, blah, blah, blah. They're not even trying to do that this time. And in fact, according to the polling, Harry Enton at 538 wrote a piece this week. I mean, this is more unpopular than most tax hike bills are, and that is highly unusual. I mean, everybody likes tax cuts on some level, right? I mean, there may be a few of us liberals, people like you and me or some others who go, no, I don't want a tax cut. We want to make sure that everybody in the country has, their Social Security is secure, whatever. And there are people like us. But really, normally, tax cut bills are very popular. This one is not popular. In fact, the only people who are behind it are Trump's base. And the reason Trump's base is behind it is because they believe him. And what he is doing, he's just doing what he always does, which is outright lying about what the bill does. And interestingly, the rest of the Congress has decided to go along with that, and they're lying about it too. Now, the numbers are clear. It's in the New York Times. It's on every broadcast. Everybody can see it. They've got charts there. It is not as if the news is not getting out there. It's that for this one group of people, which I think, 35 to 40% of the country who are have joined the Trump cult, they don't see it, or if they do, they don't believe it. They are now convinced that it's all a lie. And Trump is out there. He went to Missouri this week and gave a big speech and said, I'm going to be hurt by this. All my rich friends are mad at me, but I'm going to do it anyway because this is for you, the welder, the waitress, whatever. Total lie. I mean, it's completely the opposite of the truth, but they're all cheering and jumping up and down with excitement that they're going to get this big tax cut, which they're not going to get. So I think that what's happened is that the Republican Party has decided that Donald Trump is onto something. He blatantly lie. Don't even look right in the eye of some guy on NBC or some New York Times reporter and say black is white, up is down. That's just the way it is. Sky's green. That you and I both know that's true, and that's how it's going to be. And we're now into this world where Trump's delusions, which, we've heard a lot about that this week too, which maybe we can go into later.
Right.
The fact that this guy is basically creating an alternate reality. These Republicans are joining them because he is creating that, with the help, of course, of Fox and Breitbart and the rest of the right-wing media, is creating this alternate reality that their base has now bought into, and I think they're just figuring they might as well jump into that rabbit hole. Now, there is a problem here for those guys like John McCain and Bob Corker and Jeff Flake and some of these, allegedly reasonable Republicans who are very concerned about Donald Trump being a little out of his mind and how, he might start World War III and all the other criticisms they've had of him. You give this guy this win, and it is an absolute validation that his crazy behavior is what makes him win. This is what he believes, that if he follows his instincts, if he tweets out, Muslim snuff, videos, if he, insults everybody in sight, if he calls out, allies and adversaries alike, and he basically just denies any kind of criticism of himself as fake news. If he does that, he wins. This big bill that's going through the Congress right now, all those people who are worried about Trump, well, they just owned him, because they will have given him an absolute validation that his strategy, to the extent it's a strategy, but in his mind it is, which is, I'm just going to let me be me, and if I do that, I win, which is what he thinks happened in the presidential campaign. They will be validating that, and that is what we're going to see going forward, and they will have just escalated the danger for the country, even beyond what it already is. I mean, that on a political level, this is the worst thing they could do, to give him what he wants here. Because if they do, this guy's a megalomaniac, and he will absolutely decide that the best thing is to just don't listen to anybody, do what I want to do, my instincts are correct, and that's the best way for me to win. And that's, of course, all he cares about, and all his base cares about. So, this is a very, very dangerous moment, I think, and not just because his tax bill is an absolute grotesque atrocity of a bill. It's also, on a political level, a very dangerous thing to do.
That is a fascinating point, and I want to take a break, and I want to continue to talk about that, because I want to talk more about the sort of the political, the way the Republicans are and are not selling this politically, and where it is in the context of the way, let's say, the Bush administration sold their tax cuts. But I also want to touch on that last point that you made about the implications of passing any legislation as to how it impacts Donald Trump's power, because there was also this week a manifesto tweeted out by one of the Never Trumpers, who is becoming a bit of a icon on the left, and I want to dissect it with that same perspective. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to the great Digby, Heather Parton. We'll be right back. Hey, folks, Mike Papantonio's new book entitled Law and Vengeance, which is the follow-up to his critically acclaimed novel Law and Disorder, is finally out and available to you to buy. The book is a legal and political thriller drawing on Pap's experience both as a skilled trial lawyer and as a nationally syndicated political talk show host. The story follows trial lawyer Gina Romano, who was first introduced in Law and Disorder, on her quest for both vengeance and justice in a whistleblower lawsuit against a weapons manufacturer who developed and sold a dangerously defective rifle scope. Pap has built a story around real-life events that he's encountered as one of the top trial lawyers in America, where he's been fighting some of the world's largest and most corrupt corporations. Buy Mike Papantonio's new book, Law and Vengeance, today. Go to www.lawandvengeance.com. That's lawandvengeance.com. Check it out. I know you're going to love it. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder here with Heather Digby Parton from Salon. So, Digby, at the end of the last segment, you made the point that all of those people on the right who, particularly senators, folks like Corker, like McCain, like Flake, those who have been sounding or ostensibly have been sounding the alarm about Donald Trump, that in voting for this tax bill, and I think that let's just stipulate, there is no one you can really find, even on the right, who is arguing about, with any sincerity, it appears, about the policy benefits of this bill. It really is just slapdash, completely thrown together. The idea that John McCain and Corker and Flake would vote for a tax bill like this, Collins, and still think that they don't get to own Donald Trump as a president is just wildly mistaken, because they're allowing Donald Trump to pass anything of any meaning, enhances his authority and validates his leadership style, if you will, is the argument you've made. And I think that's absolutely correct. And I would extend that on some level to the Never Trumpers that are getting some acclaim on the left, folks like Benjamin Wittes or David Frum or Bill Kristol or George Will, where they want, on one hand, they call for a truce between those people who would fight over normal political issues to band together to fight Donald Trump. But the fact of the matter is that you can't divorce those things. And that seems to be on some level what your argument is. If you support anything that appears to be even somewhat normal process in terms of legislation and picking judges or whatever it is, you are implicitly, if not explicitly, endorsing Donald Trump's leadership style.
Well, I think so. I mean, obviously, do we have any doubt about what Donald Trump is going to do if they pass this big bill, or frankly, pass anything? He takes credit for things he hasn't done. Imagine what he's going to do if he actually gets to sign a huge tax cut. And think of this, too, in the context of an economy that's actually doing pretty well, which he also takes credit for, and doesn't. And according to the polling, most people don't believe him on that at the moment. They don't believe that this is the Trump economy. They understand on some level that the economy was growing before he came in, and that this is just an extension of the expansion that was happening under Obama. I mean, presidents can take credit for an economy that's growing while they're in there, but he's walking around saying it was, in total, hell before he took office, and now suddenly it's booming. I mean, that's just ridiculous. But if he passes this tax bill, that will definitely add to his ability to say that this is the Trump economy. That's a very powerful thing, and if they allow him to make those kinds of arguments, and again, I'll go back to what I said before. Some of this, you have to look at Trump's psychology here. Trump believes that he wins by being crazy. He wins by saying whatever comes into his head, by having no one advise him or restrain him in any way. That is what people want, and that is what, if he gives them, that is when he wins. That's what he thinks. Now, all these people, like Benjamin Wittes, if they're concerned about that aspect of Trump, which they are, you have to say you can't allow him, you can't give him that win. If you give Trump a win, you are then validating his belief that this behavior that they are all so upset about is the way to go, that that's the right strategy, that that's how he gets ahead. And, that means, in my view, I mean, I'm fine with anybody joining, I think Wittes called it a popular front. People want to join the Popular Front, fine. I'm like, if Republican voters want to vote for Democrats, everybody's welcome. Come on, we will all band together to oppose Trump. I'm all for it. But what that means is that Trump is not allowed to win. He's a president that should be treated like a lame duck, somebody who has no power and is no longer someone who has any real relevance at least certainly in the realm of legislation, which is where they have these people in the Congress have the power to make some kind of a stand on this. And to see John McCain, who, went out of his way during the ACE, came in at the last moment, after having had his terrible diagnosis and did the big thumbs down and everything, all on the basis of procedure. For him to vote for this atrocity of a tax bill, which has followed no procedures. Basically, they've been rushing it through. Yep. They won't even wait for the numbers. They're completely denying what few numbers there are, as if they say what they say. And he would vote for that? I mean, he's completely lost all credibility. I mean, not that you or I ever thought he had any, but,
yes, and I would remind people on McCain that he voted against George Bush's tax cuts for reasons that are even more applicable now. But we've got to take a break. Digby, if you'll join me in the next hour,
sure.
We have a lot more to talk about, particularly involving foreign policy and the supposed reports that North Korea can reach New York and D.C. with an intercontinental ballistic missile. You'll join me in the next hour. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Right back. Just ahead, Ryan Singal from Contextly on why we need net neutrality. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Folks, the Ring of Fire is sponsored by JustCoffee.coop. That's JustCoffee.coop. If you like fair trade, delicious coffee, tea, or chocolate, head over to JustCoffee.coop. Use the coupon code MAJORITY and get 10% off. There's free shipping. You have no reason not to get this great coffee. It's a great outfit in Madison, Wisconsin, which supported the protests there. JustCoffee.coop. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. On December 14th, Federal Communications Commission will vote to replace current rules enforcing net neutrality. Here to discuss the implications of the vote, net neutrality expert Ryan Singal from Contextly. So, Ryan, let's start with, for folks who don't know what net neutrality is, and I imagine now after literally half a decade, maybe actually more of talking about it on this program, just give us a basic overview of what net neutrality means, and then we'll get into its history of actually sort of existing, then not existing, then existing again, and then we'll find out where that lands. But broadly speaking, what do we mean when we say net neutrality?
Net neutrality is the principle that the companies that get you online, right, the on-ramp providers of the internet, companies like Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, shouldn't decide who the winners and losers are. They shouldn't interfere with traffic. Their job is simply to connect you to the apps, content, websites, podcasts of your choice.
And so the fear of, and this is, I guess, analogous to sort of the old Sinn Fin rules where that ranged from if you owned a movie house or a chain of movie theaters, you can't also own the means of production about movies because you could theoretically just say, we're just going to give our movies to our movie houses, and it would ruin basically the business of other movie houses, and that would ruin the experience for consumers.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So, this goes back, the FCC's been concerned about this for a long time. So in 2004, then the chairman of the FCC, Republican Michael Powell, gave a speech to the industry and essentially said, here's the 4 things that you have to do to make sure that we don't put strong regulations on you. And that was, allow users to use the apps of their choice, allow people to use the devices of their choice, and be transparent, right? So, this is something that's gone on that the FCC has recognized as a long time, is that the folks that get us on the internet have the ability and sometimes they have the economic motivations to distort what happens on the internet. And that's not a good outcome. And so they need to have a cop on the beat to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Give us an example of what that would be. I don't know. I mean, use, I guess, Spotify, if you will, as a
Sure.
sort of.
Okay. Well, what we're talking, you called me over Skype. Let's use kind of like online calls. I can do Spotify as well. But the first example, and this is when a Republican FCC chair stepped in to keep net neutrality. It happened in 2005. There was a ISP in North Carolina called Madison River. And, it had a landline business, and it didn't want its DSL subscribers to be making phone calls online. So it blocked a service called Vonage, essentially similar to Skype. The FCC stepped in. DSL at the time was under Title II regulations. It was a phone service, so it was not legally allowed to block content and couldn't do any unreasonable discrimination. So he stepped in and he fined Madison River and made them stop. And that sent a message across the industry that ISPs, broadband providers, should not be messing with what happens on the internet.
Now, you mentioned Title II, and let's explain what that means, because phone systems have always been, I don't know, always, but certainly in the modern era, a Title II classification versus a Title I. Tell us what the difference is between a Title I and a Title II classification. And this is a classification that sort of flipped back and forth depending over the past 15, 20 years.
Yeah, good question. So Title II of the Communications Act, if a service falls into that, if it provides sort of essentially a transport service, right, the FCC has strong authority to regulate it, right? So that's why with phones, we've always been able to call any number we want. There's been strong privacy rules. There's provisions for disabled folks. The Title
known
II
as a
rules,
common carrier.
Yeah, they're common carriers, right? So the Title II rules, back in when we had a monopoly, were pretty strong, right? And it included things like rate regulation, and then later things like unbundling, where companies had to lease their lines to other people at fair market rates. Title I services would be something that's a little bit more like an information service. So you can think of something like back in the days of an AOL, when you went to AOL and there's like lots of different things you can do there, their own forums, or if, say, you're a Bloomberg, subscribe to Bloomberg's terminal, or Google or Facebook, all of those companies sort of count as information services. So the FCC has very little authority over information services and lots of authority over common carriers.
And we should say that my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that under the Bush administration, with Michael Powell as the chair of the FCC, they changed the classification of the internet, essentially, from a Title II to a Title I. And then any attempts subsequent to that change in classification to regulate the internet, as Michael Powell threatened they would, was basically stopped by the courts and by lawsuits, because the argument is by the courts, and I think this went to the Supreme Court if I'm not mistaken, if you want the authority to do this type of regulation, you simply have to change the classification of this of the internet from a information service to a common carrier. Otherwise, you do not have the statutory authority to regulate an information service in the way that you want to. You need to change its classification. Do I have that history right?
You have that pretty close. It's a complicated one, but you're right. So DSL was considered Title II until about 2005. Cable services were kind of at the beginning when cable started serving internet. The FCC didn't know what to do with it, and it finally said, okay, this is an information service, Title I, in 2002, and that led to the case that you talked about, where the Supreme Court basically said, a very interesting decision, that the FCC had lots of leeway to decide whether something is Title I or Title II. They can squint, and even if it's clear that broadband is actually Title II, we're going to defer to you and let you go. Interestingly, Justice Antonin Scalia thought that was ridiculous and said it was very clear that broadband was Title II. So what happened, the FCC was trying to deregulate, and then they said, hey, we're just going to put in these light touch principles, and they tried to enforce them, and Comcast then sued them and said, hey, you guys have no authority. And then in 2010, the FCC tried to cobble together some other authorities. They have some authority to promote the adoption of broadband in kind of a separate section of the law, and tried to use that as ways to institute a no blocking rule. But those got knocked down in court until essentially, the ISPs had just kept pushing back against any oversight, and so eventually backed them into the corner where we are at a very clear point where if the FCC wants to institute any sort of real net neutrality protections, they can only do it under Title II.
And in fact, that reclassification happened, is my understanding, towards the end of the Obama administration, but not before. There was a record number of comments during an open comment period in support of net neutrality, which of course was a campaign promise of then candidate Barack Obama. And despite the fact that he had appointed Tom Wheeler, who was an industry lobbyist / lawyer, the net neutrality happened. That is where we are today, but it isn't necessarily where we're going to be tomorrow. And I'm using tomorrow loosely. We got to take a break. When we come back, Ryan, I want you to tell us about the import of all of those comments and why it worked last time and why it looks like it may not work this time, and what we can expect from the Donald Trump FCC. We'll be right back. I'm Sam Seder, Ring of Fire Radio. We're back on Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Right now we're discussing net neutrality with expert Ryan Singal from Contextly. So Ryan, in the last segment, we had gone over essentially the history and the essence of net neutrality. This is something that is it's a consumer protection. It's also an innovation protection. It is also, I guess, one could argue, although it's not directly tackled head on, an antitrust issue in many respects. And that is whether or not the internet is a common carrier. Is it something that is more akin to a utility in the way that we use it in this country versus a sort of, I don't know, fun thing that people can take or leave as they on a whim? And I think most people now understand the internet to be vital to living in the 21st century. And a common carrier classification also allows for the FCC to go further. Tell us how, I mean, it came down in many respects to the wire towards the end of the Obama administration, and there was a massive outpouring of comments and support for net neutrality that carried the day.
Yeah. If I could stop just one quick second, one thing I want to make clear is, Title II is about internet access, not the internet, right? So the FCC can't tell Google what to do under Title II. All of the stuff that's built, on top of internet access, that's a completely free market that's, ruled, where the FTC has authority. Just make sure that we differentiate between internet access, the people that get us online, and the greater internet, because yes, Comcast is not the internet.
FCC controls the pipes, essentially,
exactly.
Not the water, if you will.
Exactly. So, 2015, 2014, Title II was considered to be the nuclear option. It was never going, it was politically considered to be impossible to pull off, and it happened. And while net neutrality is sometimes framed as a fight between, say, Google and Facebook versus Comcast, Verizon, that debate was 2014, 2015. It wasn't driven by Google and Facebook. They were there, but they weren't the ones. This was sort of small businesses, entrepreneurs, free speech, free speech activists, and everyday Americans who have just learned, like, the live and breathe the internet now. And the support for it is, the support for net neutrality is bipartisan. So I think there was a poll this summer that said 77% of Americans support net neutrality, including 73% of Republicans. But Tom Wheeler was tough to convince. But to his credit, he listened. He held a very long process, including meetings and public hearings. I went to a meeting with him as a representative of my company, Contextually, where I was in the room with, I was a small company, but I was in the room there with folks from Stripe and folks from WordPress and Cloudflare. And he listened. He pushed back. He asked hard questions. Eventually, the Obama administration itself came out and said, like, we believe in this, put this under Title II. This is the only way to do it. We won. It was an amazing win. There's been a similar volume of support for net neutrality in this go round, but the FCC doesn't seem to be very interested in what Americans have to say. Pai's held no hearings.
Ajit Pai, the chair of the FCC.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, the FCC chair, Chairman Pai hasn't held a single public hearing. So he just seems dead set on undoing net neutrality and throwing this to just let the market decide.
So, all right, there's a whole host of questions, but let's start with the comment period, because there have been, and the Attorney General from New York State, I imagine there might be other Attorney Generals who are involved in this down the road, but there have been reportedly hundreds of thousands, if not a million or two, false comments that seem to be primarily vastly in favor of getting rid of net neutrality that have been deemed to be false. And the FCC has been aware of this for months. Attorney General Schneiderman in New York has attempted to get them to respond to it. They haven't. So here's my question to you. Is there an opportunity? Because I agree with your assessment that Ajit Pai is not interested in hearing any comments. Is there an opportunity for the ACLU, let's say, to jump in and sue after the fact and say, hey, this comment period wasn't legit, and there's statutory obligations to have a comment period in this instance?
I think there's definitely grounds for organizations to go after this order if it gets passed on procedural grounds. The comment period was ripe with, as you mentioned, with bot comments. People's online identities were attached to comments that they didn't make. There's a guy named Carl Bode who writes for DSL Reports, longtime supporter of net neutrality, right? And his name got attached to a comment, and the FCC basically just shrugged, right? They just said, we don't care. It's fine. Let it go. And I think that's, I think that's a shame, right? I think this is the first time we've seen a public comment mechanism seems to have been intentionally poisoned, and no one in the government seems to care, right? Like that's weird, right?
It's worse than weird. I think it's, the fact that the FCC doesn't care about it. We've already seen what they have done in terms of Sinclair Media, which is an organization that sat down with the Trump administration in October and worked out a deal to give better coverage to the campaign. They have been coincidentally rewarded with the ability to buy far more stations, really, than has ever been controlled, television stations ever been controlled in this country, under an anachronistic loophole. But all right, look, we just have a minute left. Let's assume, what can people do? Is it worth them trying to fight this? And then we can deal with how we reverse it.
Yes, this battle is not done. We've already seen one Republican senator, Susan Collins in Maine, has already come out to say she opposes this. While the FCC is an independent agency, it is not immune to political pressure. So the goal right now is to get Congress to come out and call on Pi to stop this plan. Easiest way to do that is a website called battleforthenet.com, which will connect you to your lawmakers in Congress and let you voice your opinions about how to stop the plan, or if you want to support the plan. But it's not a done deal. Like, there's a lot of, nobody thought we were going to get Title II, and everybody thinks it's a done deal now that it's gone. I'm not so sure. There's been, according to battleforthenet.com, they've done 500,000 calls to Congress just since this order came down. So I think we can, this is a bipartisan issue, right? Like, people on both sides care. The
right.
most, yeah. So my favorite anecdote is on Reddit and the little subreddit about NASCAR. The top-rated post ever is a post about net neutrality. It's got 10 times as many votes as any other post has ever had there, right? So, like, this isn't just right. This isn't just
this
liberal
is not
Democrats.
A partisan fight. This is one that can join in because, conservative outlets, not unlike this one, we're obviously not conservative, but ones that do similar things are in jeopardy. Ryan Signal, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Ryan Signal is a San Francisco-based blogger and journalist covering tech business, tech policy, civil liberty, and privacy issues. When we come back, Heather Digby Parton will join us to help analyze more of the news from this past week. That's just ahead. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to the Ring of Fire radio program. Don't forget, check out rofpodcast.com to support the show.